Well, welcome to Friday Night at Cary. I'm Bill Schlesinger, president of the Institute. Welcome back. It's great to see so many of our friends here, and in particular the Aldo Leopold Society members and other friends of the Institute that make this program and other public programs that we do possible. Tonight is a special treat because we have one of our own scientists to speak before us, that being Cary Lovett. Cary is a denizen of upstate New York. I'm still a little confused as to where that begins, but he's a denizen of it. He went to Union College, then got his PhD at that grand institution at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, where lots of ecologists have come from. And along those pathways, Cary made a number of studies, really seminal studies, of the interaction of atmospheric chemistry, the kinds of things that are deposited on leaves, not just from rain, but often fog water and particles that are blowing horizontally into the forest, on forest canopies, both at high elevations in New Hampshire and in some forests in Tennessee when he finished his PhD and moved down to Oak Ridge on a postdoctoral appointment. And of course we now know that some of those horizontal and not so easily noticed inputs to forests bring a lot of materials that were overlooked in previous years when we were just collecting things in open funnels and saying that's what the deposition from the atmosphere might be. And that has led Cary to do a number of activities, some with cooperation with Nature Conservancy, of looking at what he calls threats from above, the kinds of things that forests have to deal with that are often added to the atmosphere by human activities, blow downwind, and are deposited in places where we least expect them and in concentrations sometimes much higher than we ever anticipated. Cary's also developed, after being at Oak Ridge as a postdoc, he came to the staff here, where he's been here a long time, maybe 25 or 30 years or so, and is one of our senior scientists. And in the course of the last few years at least, has developed a very special interest in looking at the pests and pathogens, the kinds of bugs that inflict damage on New England and northeastern forests. And I think probably one of his messages tonight is we can think about climate change changing the distribution and abundance of species, but that, of course, is laid over the effect of pests and pathogens and the havoc they may be wreaking on forest activity and forest ability to reproduce in the future. So for those of you that own forests, those of you that love forests, those of you that love to be in forests, tonight is What's Bugging Our Forests, Cary Lovett.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. Can you hear me in the back? That's not working. Move that up a little bit. How's that? Can you hear me?
No,
it's not. Pam, could you give it a little more juice? Oh. That's a bit too much. I don't want to hear myself that well. Well, yeah, thanks for the introduction, Bill, and thank you all for coming out tonight on a dark and stormy night. Pam, could you turn the lights down, please? This is the scene of a crime. This is 27 Myrtle Street in Bedford, Massachusetts. That's just outside of Boston. And in 1869, the person living in this house was Leopold Trouvelot. Trouvelot was an interesting guy. This is his picture. He was an artist. He was an entrepreneur. He was an amateur entomologist. And he was practicing his artistry in Massachusetts here, but he was also, as I said, an entrepreneur, and he wanted to start a silk spinning industry. And so he was breeding caterpillars or moths to get a winter hardy silk moth. And in the process of doing that, he brought in a moth from Europe that he thought would help the breeding program, that would help him create this winter hardy silk moth. That moth was called the Gypsy Moth. Oh, yes, that's right. Well, he was raising this moth on trees outside his house, and they escaped into the forest. And And he knew at the time that this might be a problem. He was an amateur entomologist. And he says that he reported it to the authorities. You know, I've always tried to picture that in my head. There's this crazy Frenchman going up to a cop in Boston in 1869 saying, "The caterpillars are loose, the caterpillars are loose." Anyway, nothing happened. Nothing happened with that. Trouvelot, meanwhile, as I said, he was an interesting guy, and he was continuing to do his art, and the art he was most famous for was astronomical drawings. And he made some fabulous astronomical drawings, and he came to the attention of the Harvard Observatory and was asked to be on the faculty of the Harvard Observatory. So he went on to be an astronomer on the Harvard Observatory staff, creating drawings like these. In 1882, Trouvelot went back to France, and that was probably a wise move on his part, because about that time, the neighbors in Medford, Massachusetts started noticing strange caterpillars on the trees. Now, the richer of the neighbors could afford to hire a lot of people to try to pick these caterpillars and their egg masses off the trees, and you can see the guys they hired to do that. I mean, look at that ladder. Would you climb that ladder? But they're up there trying to pick the egg masses off the trees in the wintertime so that these outbreaks don't occur. You know, that might have been effective for a few trees. It probably wasn't very good for the forest as a whole. Here's another approach they use, this flamethrower approach. This is for real. I'm not kidding here. I'm sure this was highly effective against the gypsy moth. There was probably some collateral damage from planting. But whatever they did, they couldn't stop the spread of the gypsy moth, which continued to spread from Boston out across the eastern U.S., and it's still spreading, as a matter of fact. It spreads quite slowly. It didn't reach Virginia until the 90s, and it's now sort of at the border of North Carolina. You see this cycling through there. It's spreading like the creeping crud across the country here. It's gone into Michigan and Wisconsin. And this is the 2008 map, so you can see where the boundaries are right now. So it has spread throughout this whole region. So when a gypsy moth gets established in an area, it tends to go on an outbreak cycle with outbreak peaks about 10 years apart. And when you have an outbreak, they tend to be devastating. They start usually in oak forests, typically at the top of ridge tops where the oak trees are a bit more stressed. And they can spread out. At first, the gypsy moths really prefer the oaks. But once they get in outbreak mode, they'll eat anything that's green. This is a picture from Pennsylvania in 2007 showing a widespread outbreak. This is the middle of the summer. This is not the winter here. This graph here shows the number of acres defoliated by the gypsy moth over time. You can see there was a huge outbreak in the eastern U.S. in 1981 with 100 million acres defoliated. And there was another outbreak in the early 90s with about a million or so acres defoliated. Since that time, it's been at a somewhat lower population. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But when they go on outbreak mode, they can be very devastating. It easily became the most important defoliating insect in the country. So what happens when you get a defoliation by gypsy moth? Some things are pretty obvious. Huh? You lose the leaves and you get reduced tree growth. You get reduced seed crop, which is pretty important because acorns are an important part of the ecology of oak forests, as we know. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second also. You get reduced transpiration, reduced water loss, so you tend to get more moisture in the soil and more stream flow out of it. You have differential tree mortality. What I mean is that some trees are more susceptible than others. So, in particular, often there's a hardwood tree, a deciduous tree, can tolerate a couple of years of defoliation without dying. It just puts out new leaves the following year and keeps on going because they have some reserves they can call upon. If the tree is stressed to start out with, it might die. And so in some places you have a lot of tree mortality, in other places not so much. Conifers, however, can't tolerate any defoliation at all. So if you have mixed conifers and hardwoods in the stand, the hardwoods would tend to survive, the conifers will all die, and you change the species mix very quickly that way. And of course we have altered carbon and nitrogen cycling. I studied carbon and nitrogen cycling because they are the sort of machinery that keeps the function of the forest going. And so you'll be hearing a little bit about those as we go through the talk here today. Let's talk a little bit about nitrogen in the canopy. This is one of our studies from here at the Institute. This is what happens to the nitrogen that's in the tree foliage. So nitrogen is a very important element for trees because it's usually limiting their productivity. So if you add more nitrogen, the tree grows better. And they try to hold on to all the nitrogen they've got. So these pie charts tell you what happens to the nitrogen that's in the canopy of a tree in the summertime. What happens to it? So in a low defoliation, in sort of a normal year, this yellow pie is resorption. That's the main part of the nitrogen is resorbed, and that means that it's pulled back into the tree before the leaves fall, and that nitrogen can be stored over the winter and used to build new leaves in the fall. It's a neat trick that trees do to be able to conserve that important nutrient of nitrogen. And then some of it is lost. It can't be recovered. It's lost in the fall leaf drop, so it goes to the soil, and there's other little bits going to insects and leaching out of the foliage and things like that. Now, when you have a gypsy moth defoliation, it's a totally different story. The resorption is reduced to a very small portion like that. So that means that all the nitrogen that tree was trying to conserve, because the defoliation happened during the summertime, it didn't get a chance to do that. And it loses that nitrogen to the forest floor. So this would be like you taking your money out of the bank and throwing it on the street. You might get some of it back, but probably not much. We lose some nitrogen to fall leaf drops. Some of it goes into frass. Frass is the polite word for insect excrement. Saying frass. If you ever walk through a gypsy moth defoliated forest, you'll know that the stuff that's coming down on your head is frass. Early leaf drops. So the gypsy moths are very sloppy eaters, and they lose a lot of leaves as they eat. There's increased leaching out of the foliage because of the damage that's being caused, and there's some insect biomass. All of this stuff is lost to the tree. Actually, all of this stuff is lost to the tree, so that the tree no longer has the reserves that it had before, and that can be devastating to the tree. We were kind of curious about what happens to all of this. Can the tree recover it from the soil, because it all went into the soil? We did an experiment. This is Lynn Christensen, who was a graduate student here at the time. I don't know if she's in the audience or not, but she's now a professor at Vassar. And she was doing her master's project here, where she was labeling a tree with nitrogen-15. Nitrogen-15 is a stable isotope. It's not a radioactive isotope, but it's present in natural quantities in all nitrogen. But if we boost the quantity a little bit, we can trace where the nitrogen goes. And we're doing that with this tree. We labeled the tree with nitrogen, and we took some of the foliage and we fed it to gypsy moths to produce their frass. So that was also tagged so that we could follow it. And we put it on plots in the forest out here. Some of the plots had leaves that are added to it naturally. Others had the frass that we added. And we could see what happened to the nitrogen. For the ones that had normal leaf fall, most of the nitrogen stayed in the litter layer on the top of the soil where the trees could get at it. For the ones that had frass added, all the nitrogen was distributed lower in the soil, and it was bound to the soil. So a lot of this nitrogen was deeper in the soil and unavailable to the trees. So they're losing a lot of the nitrogen that comes off of them when this defoliation happens. Overall, though, the whole ecosystem has a pretty tight conservation of nitrogen unless the trees die. If the trees die, then they lose that nitrogen entirely, but otherwise it stays in the soil, possibility of remobilizing later on. Now, gypsy moths interact with the oak forest in a number of other ways. This is some work that was done by Rick Ostfeld, Clive Jones, and other scientists here at the Institute. You may have heard Rick or Clive talk about this in the past, but basically it's showing the web of interactions in an oak forest. Oak tree produces acorns, as you know. Those acorns are very important in the forest. They feed animals like deer and mice and chipmunks and so forth. And those mice and chipmunks are important for the whole ecology of the system because they're important for the way humans use the system as well, because the mice are the main reservoir of Lyme disease. They feed ticks, and the ticks can get the Lyme disease bacteria, which then humans can pick up from that. So acorns are involved in the whole cycle of mouse population dynamics that determines the availability of this, or the susceptibility of people to this tick and the Lyme disease. But the mice are involved in something else as well. They also eat. They're voracious predators of the gypsy moth. They eat both the pupae and the caterpillars. And in fact, when the populations of the gypsy moth are low, the mice can eat enough of them to keep that population from exploding. So there can be some control exerted by the mice on that population. And this cycles back, because if there are a lot of gypsy moths that make it out, then of course the oak trees don't perform as well. There aren't as many acorns, and the whole thing can cycle around. So you can see that there's a complex web of interactions there in which the gypsy moths are involved. Clive Jones has been keeping track of the gypsy moth population here at the Institute since he got here in 1980. And here's the population measurements that he made. This is measured in the number of egg masses that are found per hectare of ground out there. And this is a logarithmic scale, so every tick mark is 10 times greater than the one before it. You can see he caught that big outbreak in 1980 and 1981, and there was a decline. He caught the outbreak again in 1989 and 1990, and since that time, the population of gypsy moths has been bouncing around, but at a fairly low level. This red line is an approximate level of where you might see noticeable defoliation. So here's some of our workers that are measuring the gypsy moth populations out there. So what is it that's causing that to not be an outbreak? I mean, we haven't had a gypsy moth problem here for quite a while. And the reason is there's a fungus that's gotten into the gypsy moth population. It's called Entomophagy Madonna, and that's kind of an interesting story in itself. The fungus, the Entomophagy fungus, was introduced as a biocontrol agent for gypsy moths in 1910. It didn't do any good. They were hoping that it would control the gypsy moth populations, but it didn't do any good. And you saw that map that just kept spreading throughout the whole 20th century. So they gave up. They said it was a lost cause. And then they used a whole bunch of things to try to spot control the gypsy moths, but they haven't been able to stop the spread. But then in 1989, this fungus showed up again in a population in Connecticut, and since then it's spread throughout the whole range of gypsy moths and seems to be able to control the population now. So when these outbreaks start, the fungus gets the caterpillars, and the outbreak stops. So nobody knows. This is a big mystery. Nobody knows why this happened. This thing evolves from virulence. Was it reintroduced? I'm not quite sure what happens, but it's turned out to be an effective biocontrol agent for the gypsy moths. It's just kind of a magical one. We still have outbreaks. They still happen, but they're not these large synchronous outbreaks throughout the whole Northeast. They tend to be spotty, and they tend to be brief. We had one in the Catskills in the summer of 2005. That's an oak forest there. It was one of our workers down there. And that's, again, in the middle of the summer. So that was a pretty severe outbreak, but it only lasted a year. And when you have an outbreak, I mean, these are all caterpillars on the trunk of this tree. So there's a lot of caterpillars out there. The thing about these caterpillars is they're all dead. And they're all dead from that fungus. So in the second year, these caterpillars basically tried to defoliate the tree, and they all died because of the fungus, and we didn't get the second year of outbreak. So this is a good thing that's happened to the gypsy moth. We haven't seen him for a while. The story's still unfolding. Clive's still measuring the populations of gypsy moths, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but right now, it looks pretty good. Okay. In 1890, just about the time that Trouvelot's neighbors were noticing all those caterpillars on their trees, somebody brought in a beech tree, young beech tree, to the public gardens in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's understandable why they would want to bring in a European beech tree. They grow to be huge spreading trees and very pretty in a landscaping sense. But the ones that were brought into Halifax had the beech bark disease on them. Beech bark disease is an interaction, really, between two different organisms. The first one is the beech scale, Cryptococcus fagusuga. And that's a picture of it here. These things are about 1 millimeter across, and you usually don't see them this well. They're usually covered by a waxy coating, so all you see is kind of a white, waxy film on the trees. The scale insect pokes a hole in the bark, and that hole provides an entry point for one of two species of fungus, both of the genus Neonectria. The fungus gets in and starts causing bark lesions. And very slowly over time, the cankers on the bark swell, and they can actually coalesce, and they can kill the tree slowly over time. As I said, this was introduced into Halifax, Nova Scotia. It spread throughout the eastern U.S. in a range that looks very similar to the gypsy moth. The green on this slide is the range of beech, and the red and the blue are where the beech bark disease is now. So this, even though this is the range of beech, the core of the range is up in this area, the forests and the mountains and the Adirondacks and the Catskills and up in Vermont and New Hampshire. And so the beech bark disease has pretty much covered the core of the range of beech. It's spread out into the upper Midwest, populations in West Virginia. These are the Smoky Mountains. I don't know if you've ever driven along the road in the Smoky Mountains that goes to those beautiful beech gaps. Well, they're not that beautiful anymore because they're dying from this disease. So what are the effects of the beech bark disease? As I said, it kills trees slowly over time. So a healthy beech has a beautiful gray bark and can be a very large tree. It grows for a long time. Once the bark fungus starts to take hold, you get these lesions in the bark. You start seeing these big warts showing up. And by the time the tree is well infected, the bark looks like that. So it really disfigures the tree. At the same time, the canopy falls apart slowly, branches falling off. And over a long period of time, the tree just falls apart and dies. So as you can imagine, this opens up gaps in the forest. Beech usually grows in mixed stands with other species. And it shifts the forest structure for sure. In many of these stands where the beech dies, beech is also a prolific root sprouter, so the beech sprouts come up, and what you get is a tangle of young beech sprouts, which when they get older, they get the disease as well. But that's really difficult to get through. We call it beech hell when we're sampling it because you just can't move through it very well. Here's a picture of an example here. There's a lot of small stems. And so that's reduced beech from a tree of large stature, a canopy tree, to more of a scrubby understory tree in the forest. A lot more smaller trees. In other places, like in the Catskills where we study, the decline of beech has been accompanied by an increase in one of its main competitors, which is sugar maple. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So we have shifts in forest composition and structure. We have a loss of food source for wildlife. So in many beech forests, beech is the main species that produces hard nuts. Those are the large nuts that a lot of animals eat. So beech nuts are very favored food for a lot of different animals, turkeys, some birds, small mammals, but also bears. And bears will climb beech trees to get at the beech nuts. There's a bear claw mark on a beech tree. You can often go up to a smooth beech tree and you can see the marks where the bears climbed up the tree. And they don't pick the nuts off the tree. They can't get out enough on the branches. They go up there and they just shake those trees until the nuts fall down. Then they come down on the ground and hoover them up. So they're a very important food for bears in the fall where they fatten up for the wintertime. And as you reduce the structure of the beech forest from large trees that produce a lot of nuts to small trees that don't produce as many nuts, then obviously that's going to affect the food source for the bears. And they're going to be looking for other food sources. I don't know if you saw the article in the paper this summer that said that a bear broke into a candy shop in Old Forge in the Adirondacks. That would be one substitute food. I think beech nuts would be better for them over the long haul, but I'm sure that was one happy bear for a while. Okay, so we also have an interaction with nitrogen status of the trees. Charlie Cannon and one of his students did some very interesting work where they showed that the increasing nitrogen concentration in the bark makes these beech trees more susceptible to the beech bark disease. So by adding air pollution to the forest in the way we drive our cars and produce power that produces nitrogen oxides that rains down in the forest, increases the nitrogen status of the plant. But that makes it more palatable to these bugs, and so that we could be increasing the susceptibility of the beech to the bark disease. Then there's shifts in nitrogen cycling and retention in the forest as well. We've been doing quite a bit of work on beech bark disease out in the Catskills. A crew of mine has been out there. I'm sure you all know where the Catskills are. But we found the Catskills were first affected by beech bark disease in the early 1950s. And the state foresters at the time reported massive die-offs of beech. 75% of the beech everyone died as this first wave of beech bark disease came through. Now we're in what we call the aftermath forest. We find that about 99% of the beech trees in the Catskills are affected by this disease. About 20% of them, though, seem to be tolerant of it. So we can see either the bug or the fungus on the tree, but the tree is still growing okay. So there seems to be some resistance in the population. So beech are not going to go extinct. We're just changing sort of the structure of the forest. We know that most of the larger beech trees are gone. We rarely see one over 20 inches in diameter. And there's been an overall shift in species composition towards sugar maple. We can tell partly that because we have a series of plots that were measured back in 1970 by a person who was doing his PhD thesis at SUNY ESF in Syracuse. And he put in a lot of permanent plots, and we were able to resurvey those plots, and we could see that in the plots that had beech in them, there was a shift towards sugar maple in those plots. Now, what we didn't catch was the initial wave back in the 50s. There's no data from before then, so we can't go back and see what happened in that first wave. We're just catching sort of the aftermath of this. So I think the shift from beech to maple is actually larger than what we can actually measure with these data. We asked ourselves also, what does the shift from beech to maple, does it make a difference in the functioning of the forest? And so we put out a study to take a look at that. We looked at a gradient of stands, starting with mixed beech maple stands, through stands that the beech are dying from beech bark disease, and finally to stands where maple dominates and the only beech are dead stems on the forest floor. And we looked at a number of plots across this gradient and measured all sorts of things about the forest functioning, and we can see that the change in species composition as a result of that, which is the long-term effect of this disease. There's just the short-term effect of the disturbance, but the long-term effect is this shift in species composition. We can see that causes changes in ecosystem function, things like litter decomposition and nitrate leaching to the streams. And that's important for the water quality in the Catskills. So in the 1950s, just about the same time those foresters were seeing massive die-off of the beech in the Catskills, some nursery brought a Asian hemlock into Virginia. And they brought it to sell it. It was eventually planted in someone's garden, I'm sure. But hitchhiking on that Asian hemlock was the Hemlock Wooly Adelgid. The Hemlock Wooly Adelgid is a tiny bug. This is a magnified view. You can see them as little spots. At least the students we work with can see them as little spots. I can't really see them that well. But they're tiny little spots that these are nymphs that settle into the base of the needles. What you do see is when these turn into adults, they produce a woolly covering over them that protects them from the weather and from predators, and they lay their eggs in there and they mature in there. And so what you see on the underside of the hemlock needles is this woolly coating, which is why it's called the Hemlock Wooly Adelgid, obviously. It was hitchhiking on these trees that were brought into Virginia in the 50s, as I said. It spread very slowly for a while and didn't really cause much damage to the hemlocks, but when it got in the area of New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, in this area, it encountered more hemlocks and it really started to explode. And this happened in the 80s. We've had it around long enough that we're starting to see, we're pretty sure we know what the effects of this thing are. It's very highly lethal to hemlocks. Most trees die after as little as 4 to 6 years of infestation. There seems to be very little resistance in the hemlock population. We know it can set back succession because hemlock is an old growth species. It tends to grow slowly under the forest. It comes up and takes over the canopy eventually over time. It can grow for a very long time. This is a picture I took in the Catoctin Mountains. It doesn't show up very well on the screen here. So this is from Maryland. This is an oak forest, which is a successional forest, and this hemlock was growing up underneath it. And eventually this would have become a hemlock forest. But the hemlock is dying from the Hemlock Wooly Adelgid, and so it would really set back the succession in this system. Another important thing about hemlocks is they're usually the main conifer in the deciduous forest that we have around here, so they are an important habitat type. And for instance, I'll talk about it a little bit more, what that means for birds. When they often tend to grow along streams, and so when they die, it opens up the stream for more light and more heat, so you get higher temperatures in the streams, and that can affect the stream community. So in the short term, we have disruption of ecosystem processes like production of biomass and nutrient cycling and so forth due to the disturbance. In the long term, though, we have a species change from this long-lived, old-growth conifer to probably more fast-growing deciduous species. And so that's going to have a major effect on the ecosystem as well. The effects of Hemlock Wooly Adelgid sort of ramify through the ecosystem in a lot of different ways, and I've just noted a few of them here. And they also, they point out the interaction with other stressors that are going on. The Hemlock Wooly Adelgid itself is sensitive to the amount of nitrogen in the tree, the same way the beech bark disease is. It's also very sensitive to temperature, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. The hemlock trees, which are obviously sensitive to Hemlock Wooly Adelgid, they're also sensitive to the availability of nitrogen in the system because they can grow better if they have more nitrogen, but they can also become more susceptible to the bug. And they also have particular climate requirements, so changing climate will affect them. And then we have various birds. There was a recent study from Connecticut that showed in stands where the hemlock was declining, there was a 93% decline in the black-throated green warbler. In that area, black-throated green warblers are almost obligate on hemlock trees. Now, in other areas, they are all over the place. They're deciduous stands. But in that area, they really nest in hemlock trees, and the decline of the hemlock tree caused a decline of the bird. And since they open up the stream, they can also have effect on cold water fisheries like brook trout. So the little bug, by affecting a big tree, the effects can ramify up through the system. And we talked a little bit about climate before. I put on this map that the northern extent of the Hemlock Wooly Adelgid is set by climate. We know that because there's been a couple of neat studies that show that Adelgid itself, the bug, is very sensitive to cold winter nights. Nights of about 5 below will kill most of the bugs. Nights of about 10 below Fahrenheit will just about kill all of them. But if you lived here for a while, you know we don't get those nights as often as we used to. In fact, we know the climate is warming, and winter nights are the part of the climate that's warming fastest. Right? So as we warm up the climate, we're reducing the number of cold winter nights, and we're increasing the ability of this bug to survive. So it is slowly moving northward as the climate warms. There's another interesting thing going on here. Well, actually, so let's talk about this. There's been projections made of how far it will get. Okay, based on climate warming, this is a projection from the Northeast Climate Impact Assessment. The blue is where the Adelgid could live right now. The tan is where it could live in the year 2100 if we have the climate that would be predicted from a lower emission scenario. So if we've got to act to get on reduced carbon emissions, we'll still have a warmer climate and the bug will expand, but there will be places in the Northeast where the bug can't get and hemlock will survive. If we have the higher emissions scenario, which is the track we're on right now, all of the Northeast will be basically available habitat for this bug, and we'll lose all our hemlocks, basically. Okay, so that's kind of a grisly scenario of what can happen. But there's another thing going on as well that's really kind of fascinating. We know that the Hemlock Wooly Adelgid populations at the northern end of the range are more cold tolerant than the ones at the southern end of the range. This is really kind of interesting because what that means is that there's evolution going on. That as the bug moves north, it becomes more tolerant of the cold because it's evolving this tolerance to cold conditions. And that's particularly interesting because all of these Hemlock Wooly Adelgids are parthenogenetic. That means that they reproduce asexually. There's only females involved here, no males. And, I mean, that's not a great way for a bug to live. And when the bug exists in Asia, there are males. And what happens is one of the generations that happens per year produces both males and females. The males fly off to a host of a spruce tree, and they grow up on the spruce tree, and then they come back and mate with the females, and you have sexual reproduction, and the whole thing goes on. In North America, though, there's no suitable spruce host, so the males fly off and die. So the males are totally useless, and the females have to do all the work by themselves. You can see women nodding their head in there. That's the way the whole thing works. But so that means that they only reproduce asexually. Probably just a few bugs were brought in, and essentially all of the Hemlock Wooly Adelgids in the eastern U.S. are one large clone. So they're genetically identical, but nonetheless they're evolving. Usually it takes a lot of variability to cause evolution. You have to have variability among individuals, and natural selection acts on that variability. Here we have a population that's genetically identical, and evolution is still happening. It's probably because there's enough mutation going on to produce a little bit of variability that can make this happen. So it's an interesting evolutionary story, but it also demonstrates how there can be an interaction between stresses going on. There can be an interaction between climate change, nitrogen, and these introduced pests that makes the whole story quite complicated. Okay, well, in 1998 or so, just about the time we started seeing Hemlock Wooly Adelgids here on the Cary Institute property, a shipping container landed in Detroit. Nobody knows exactly how it got there. It probably came in on a container ship like this, and there are millions of shipping containers that come into this country every year on big ships like this. This one came into Detroit, and in it was wood packing material, and hitchhiking in that wood packing material was a small insect called the emerald ash borer. Beautiful insect. It's a tiny little thing. It's got very iridescent green wings, and it's got this red abdomen. So it's a beautiful, tiny little insect. Here's you can see some fingers so you can get a sense of the scale of the insect itself. But it has a very voracious appetite for ash trees. The larvae bore around under the bark. They create these galleries that eventually, when there's enough boring going on, kill the tree. And they can do that quite rapidly, actually, as the population expands. So it was originally brought into the Detroit area. As I said, it's expanded throughout this whole range here. Just a couple of years ago, it got into New York State, and you can see the places where they found it in New York State. And I think it was a year or two ago, a population hopped over to Saugerties, so we had it in Ulster County. And then a few other populations got going in Ulster County, and just this past year, just in March, they found it first in Dutchess County near Rhinebeck. So this thing is moving. It moves in jumps. And it moves in jumps because it seems to be traveling in firewood. People move firewood around, the bug's in the firewood, and wherever the firewood lands, the bug can get out, and then you've got a new population. But it's advancing towards us or upon us now. It's new enough that there hasn't been a lot of research on the impacts of the ash borer. We know that it's pretty lethal to ash. It kills just about everyone that it infests, and it doesn't take too long to happen. We know that about 7% of the trees in New York State are ash. So it's an important tree, but it's certainly not a dominant tree. But it can be dominant in certain areas, particularly successional forests and wetlands. And there's 3 different species of ash: black ash, green ash, and white ash. White ash is more of an upland species. Green and black are more wetland species. And this bug likes all of them, thank you. It can be devastating in these wetlands and successional forests where the ash is dominant. Ashes also has some particular uses, some very special uses. It's the main wood that's used for baseball bats, for instance. The Native Americans in Maine use it for basket weaving, so they're afraid they might lose all their ash trees. So there are particular uses that ash is used for, and those are, if the ash trees die, we're going to lose those. So we've just started to see some research on the impacts of the ash borer. I was just at a conference a few weeks ago where some of this was presented. It's work from students at Ohio State. This is one slide I wanted to show you. This student was looking at a gradient from healthy ash forests to places where the ash was declining to places where it had already declined and the ash would die. And he looked at the birds across that gradient. You could see a shift in bird composition, which I would think won't surprise any of the birders here, because birds react very strongly to the structure of the canopy. This is out in central Ohio, so the bird species are a little bit different in terms of habitat than we might see them here, but some of them are the same. So in these more dense forests, you have things like ovenbird and the blue-gray gnatcatcher, which out there is a canopy species. As the bugs start to proliferate here, we get more red-bellied woodpeckers, which really like the bugs. Okay, so we have a shift in birds there. As you get to these forests where the canopy is more open and shrubs are starting to develop underneath, you get more general species like cardinals and catbirds. And by the time you get to this stage where the canopy has died and there's only a few scattered trees around of non-ash trees, you get species like the Baltimore oriole, which likes park-like open areas, and yellow warblers, which like shrubby habitat. So there's a total turnover in bird species composition as this forest declines. There's a lot of other impacts. Some of these talks we're speaking about changes in the understory and changes in other forms of wildlife and so forth. There's quite a bit of research going on, but this is new enough that we're just starting to figure this out. Okay, so I just talked about 4 of these pests. Unfortunately, I just picked out 4, and I could have picked out any number of pests because there's a lot of them out there. So we talked about gypsy moth and beech bark disease, Hemlock Wooly Adelgid, emerald ash borer. Could have talked about chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease. You've heard of all these. There's balsam woolly adelgid. There's a lot of pests. So the whole problem is that we have many of them, and they're happening all at once. And we have some that are threatening more than others. For instance, the Asian longhorn beetle. This is a large beetle. It's about as big as your thumb. This is something else that comes in wood packing material. We've had outbreaks of the Asian longhorn beetle in New York, New Jersey, Chicago, Toronto. The most recent outbreak was in Worcester, Mass, where they had to take down 25,000 trees in the city in order to get rid of this infestation. And they're not sure yet they've gotten rid of it. This one likes maples, particularly. We'll also go out there a number of different hardwood trees. We have sudden oak death, which is out in the west. This is a fungal type disease of oak trees. It's killing live oaks and tan oaks in the western U.S. It infects other species as well, but it's most lethal on the oaks. It hasn't gotten out yet in the eastern forests, but it's threatened because we know that the eastern oaks are susceptible to it. We have Cyrex wood wasp, which is a boring wasp, boring in the sense that it gets into the wood and bores around, like the larvae do. This is known to be a major pest of pines, and there was an outbreak of it in Rochester recently, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen with that. So these are species that are sort of waiting in the wings to be the next big actors here. And these pests have been mapped where they occur most frequently. The bluer colors here are more pests. This is the number of pests established per county. And you can see that we are ground zero for this. Why is that? I mean, I think nobody really knows. I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that we share a lot of tree types with Europe and Asia. Europe and Asia have maples, they have oaks, they have hemlocks. Many of the genera of trees that we have also occur in those other areas. And of course, all of this introduction of these bugs is happening by trade. So when we trade with those other areas, we're likely to get bugs that like our tree species. And I should point out that the fact that we have all these bugs here it sounds like our trees are just limping. But we are sending some bugs the other way. It's just that we have a balance of bugs problem the same way we have a balance of trade problem. More of them are coming this way than are going the other way. And the reason that the trees are so susceptible is what's called evolutionary naivete. They've never been exposed to these bugs. In the native range, these bugs are known, but they're not a big problem. In the new range, when they get to a new continent, there's no natural enemies. The trees have not evolved defenses to them, and so they can take off. And that's why we have all these outbreaks. Okay, so we have a lot of these bugs, and they're all happening at the same time. And so the question is not just what is one bug doing, but what are they all doing together? Charlie Canham here on our staff is running models, computer models now, that look at all these bugs together and what they might do to the composition of the forest over time. So we're looking at that problem as well. How much does all this cost? Well, there are a lot of costs to these invasions, as you might expect. This was a recent study done by Juliana Okima and some others, and I don't think this is the last word on it, but it's a decent try at what this might cost. And this is an annual cost in billions of dollars, divided up into several different categories. And it's also divided up by the type of the guild of bugs. There's wood borers, sap feeders, and foliage feeders. You can see that most of these costs are borne by either local governments, individual households, or by reduction of property values due to the decline of trees. So it's really local governments and just individual property owners like you and me that are paying the bulk of the cost of these things. And these costs are present in replacing trees and in reduced property values and in having the government have to replace trees in parks and along streets. Timber value is a surprisingly small portion of this, and I think that's because of the bugs they chose to make this calculation. They used the Hemlock Wooly Adelgid, the emerald ash borer, and the gypsy moth as sort of poster pests to make these estimates, and none of those really affects a species that is a major timber species. So if they, for instance, were to take the Asian Longhorn beetle, which eats maples, or the sudden oak death, which kills oaks, I think the timber value would go up substantially. But as it is, the total cost here is about $5 billion a year. That still sounds like a lot of money to me. And as I said, it's mostly borne by local governments and homeowners. This doesn't include non-market value. So, we don't. What is the value of the 200-year-old ash tree property? What's the value of an old growth hemlock stand? Those things can't be really monetized, so it doesn't include those, obviously. And another thing to think about is who profits and who pays here, because the profit is all to people who import the pests, right? People who are shipping things in or bringing in plants into nurseries, and who pays? We all pay. So I'd like to talk a bit about whether this problem can be solved. The eradication of established pests is virtually impossible. Once they're established, it's almost impossible to get rid of them. This is really, as I put in the last slide, this is biological pollution. We think about chemical pollution, that we can, if we have a political willpower, we can turn off the smokestacks and reduce chemical pollution. But biological pollution, once these things are in, it's very, very difficult to get rid of them. We can slow their spread, though. And there's a lot of activity going on now, particularly amongst state governments and local governments, to try to slow the spread by reducing the movement of firewood and things like that. And that can buy us some time. And that's important, because the main remedy we have for these introduced pests, for ones that are already established, is biological control. And that's when you bring in an enemy to this pest that can keep up with it, basically we don't want to spray a lot of insecticides around because those have their own problems. But if we get a biological agent that can take care of it, like the fungus is taking care of the gypsy moth, then there's some potential for control, not eradication, but control of these pests. Biological control, though, has a lot of potential, but it is difficult to find a pest that can actually do the job that it needs to do, that can survive in this area and doesn't get out and harm other things as well. You're bringing in a biological control agent, you're actually bringing in another introduced species, and that's a risky thing. But there are some notable good examples. The Entomophagy is one. There's some agricultural examples where biological control has worked very well. There are biological control agents, a couple of species of small beetles have been brought in to try to control the Hemlock Wooly Adelgid. So far they haven't done it in the field, although they are shown to survive and eat the adelgid. They just haven't controlled the population. And there's new biological control agents that are being worked on for the emerald ash borer also, but nothing has quite succeeded yet. But if we can slow it down, we can buy some time and let those research activities through. As my colleague Dave Strayer often says, we should be focusing on the next pest, not the last one, and I think that is entirely true. The ones that are established are difficult to deal with, but we don't want any more coming in if we can avoid it. And in order to do that, we need some action at the federal level, because this is all about importation from other countries, right? And we need to control the major vectors, which are live plants for the nursery trade, and wood packing material. By wood packing material, I mean crates, pallets, spools of wire are a big source. And also there's material called dunnage, which is just raw wood that's put into these shipping containers to stabilize the load. And these wood-boring insects in particular can get in all those different ways. So what can we do about this? What can you do? What can I do? Certainly one thing we can do is use native rather than imported plants in the landscape. I'm sure you've heard that before, but this gives you an idea of how important that is, because certainly if there's no demand for introduced plants from gardeners, then there will be no importation of introduced plants. So that's the demand side. We can also not move firewood around, because as I told you, that's a major vector for moving wood-boring beetles around from place to place. So if you go camping somewhere, buy the firewood there. It'll help the local economy, and it will keep you from moving that around. You can also contact your representatives in Congress and let them know that this is a problem, because it's not on the radar screen of many people in Congress at this point. And what's the Cary Institute doing? Well, we're continuing to do our research on the impacts of pests. Several of us here are doing research on exotic pests and pathogens. As I mentioned, Charlotte Canham, Shannon Ledoux is doing some work on Hemlock Wooly Adelgid, Clive Jones doing work on Gypsy Moth, and I do work on beach bark disease and Hemlock Wooly Adelgid and some other things. So there's a group of us that are working on this problem just to find out what the impacts are and to understand the population dynamics and the spread of these things. We're also starting to lead an initiative to sort of summarize the scientific information on this and marry that to an outreach campaign that's aimed at media and at federal legislators. So what we want to do is get scientists together from around the country, summarize the scientific information on this, to write a scientific paper, a technical paper, but also to write a more lay brochure that can be read by media people and can be delivered to people in Congress, and then we would have briefings with both media and with Congress to try to elevate the knowledge about this issue and the concern about this issue so that we can hopefully get some policy action done. We have laid out a plan for this. That the whole thing costs about $100,000 with the workshops we need to do and the publications we need to produce. And we have a matching grant of $50,000 from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. So we're looking right now for that extra matching money so we can get going on this. And I really do hope we get going on it soon, because certainly the problem's not going to get any better if we wait. Okay, that is all I wanted to say. I'd be happy to stop here and take questions if there are any. Yeah, let's turn up the lights.
Yeah.
Can you bring up the lights a bit? There we go. Good. Yeah.
Yes, about the ladybugs and the woolly adelgid. As I mentioned to you when I was walking in the Audubon Society in Sharon, we actually saw the woolly adelgid under wheels and the ladybugs munching on them.
Mm-hmm.
But, are they a realistic predator for the woolly adelgid?
One would hope. I don't know of any examples. Maybe somebody can give me an example. I don't know of any examples where this has actually controlled the Hemlock Wooly Adelgid population in the wild. We know that the bugs survive. We know that they eat the adelgid. They just don't seem to be getting abundant enough to actually control the adelgid populations. So we can hope this takes off. Right now, I don't see that it's that.
Could you add more?
Yeah, that's what's happening. That's why they're there, basically, because they've been put out there. Yeah.
Since a lot of these pests are coming from lands overseas, are we learning anything from their experience? Are they coping with these things over there?
Well, as I said, the reason we have a problem is because our forests are evolutionarily naive. They haven't been exposed to these pests in the past. Over in China, for instance, these bugs are not a problem, right? And because they have natural enemies there, and the trees are evolved to that. But so it's really not a problem that we can learn from. But when we're looking for biological control agent, and I'm using the broad form of we here, I don't actually do that work, but the entomologists and the pathologists who are looking for a biological control agent will go to the home range of the pest and look for things that either infect that pest or eat that pest, and they'll bring it back and they'll do trials to see if that would be an effective biological control agent. So that is what we learn. And in the same way, there are pests here that are not a problem, but when they get loose overseas, they can be a big problem. A good example is a pest that we call the fall webworm, and you've seen it. It makes sort of a web-type structure around the outside of branches of trees. You see it in the fall sometimes. It's really not much of a pest here. It doesn't do much damage. It's loose in China now and causing a big problem for them. Yeah, back there. I don't. That's a household pest. I don't know too much about it. I'm not sure that it does much damage to forests. I haven't heard about that. Do you know of some indication that it's affected forests? Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it eats trees at all. And mainly, it's a household pest that gets into your house and drives you nuts.
Here, there's one over here.
Okay.
I was very similar to this gentleman. I was just wondering if there are any techniques that the overseas recipients of our pests are doing that we could learn. You kind of addressed it, the idea of looking at biological control, but I didn't know if they were a little more freer in implementing biological controls or anything of that nature.
No, I don't think so. I think we probably have the problem worse than any country anywhere, except maybe New Zealand or something, where there's an awful lot of pests being introduced. But so I think they're learning from us rather than us learning from them. I should mention that Asian longhorn beetle. This is an interesting story. Asian longhorn beetle, which came to us from Asia, is now a big pest in China. And the reason it's a big pest in China is because they're planting a lot of American trees over there. They're reforesting large areas of China. They're doing it with North American poplars, which have all of a sudden become the bait for these Asian longhorn beetles. So they have a big problem with a native bug on non-native trees. So. Back there? Bob?
I remember the Gypsy Moth outbreak in the 80s. Toward the end, there was some kind of, I think it was something wasp virus that got into them. When they died, they hung these upside down.
Yeah.
And I noticed that this was not that.
Right.
Is it something different?
Yes.
Just heat it up?
There is a virus also that gets the gypsy moth, a nuclear polyhedrosis virus that's often used as an agent against insects. And this is actually sprayed as a biological control agent for gypsy moths. And it kills them in that V-shape thing that you talked about. And so that can be important when it's sprayed on the population, and occasionally it kills some insects when it's not sprayed, but in general, the fungus is the main mortality agent for these things.
Maybe one more.
Done?
I know that the nursery trade goes to China to collect new perennial shrubs. I've been told that they are under strict regulations to clean them before they come back. But are you saying this is not just trees, but also shrubs and all kinds of plants should not be brought in?
Yeah, I think the inspection and the regulations for requiring that the plants be cleaned, it's very difficult to enforce that. We just don't have the manpower to be able to do that. And there's regulations that all wood packing material has to be treated also, but I mean, are you going to inspect every shipping container? You just can't do it. So I really think that source really has to be cut off. It's just so difficult to regulate that, it's just too risky to do, I think, in my view.
Well, I think let's have people come down and chat with you up front here. Cary, this has been great fun. It's going to make everybody in the audience hope for a really cold winter this year.
Right.
And to elect representatives that want to do something about the changing climate. But many thanks for bringing all this to light for us tonight. Let me also give you a brief reminder of our next Friday night at Cary. Janice Ray coming here on November 16th. It's hard to believe it's already November. She is a well-known author, and her new book deals with the legacy of seeds, not just with the genetic material that a seed in hand captures and carries and stores for the next generation, but the legacy of culture that is passed on from generation to generation by people that collect seeds, sort seeds, shell seeds, and have done this in families and have a household tradition of doing so. She'll be doing some readings from her new book on seeds. Should be a great evening, roughly a month from now. We'll see you here then. Thanks.